Where'd you hear that?
The internet.
And you believed it?
Yeah. They can't put anything on the internet that isn't true.
Where'd you hear that?
The internet. Oh, look. Here comes my date. I met him on the internet. He's a French model.
Bonjour.
So today's edition of Breaking the Internet, we go to Bernie Sanders. He has a tweet out from about a week ago, but he makes this claim. In 1980, CEOs made 30 times more than the average worker. Last year, the CEO to worker compensation ratio was 312 to 1. Together, we must finally create an America that works for all of us, not just those at the top. So there's a couple of really big problems with this claim. First of all, the income inequality argument, which is basically what this stems from. He's saying that there is a problem in this country because back in the year 1980, then people were making roughly 30 to 1 what their lowest paid employee was. Now it's about 312 to 1. So it stems from the idea that that is somehow bad. That is somehow evil. But a lot of people that buy into this argument never stop to think, well, why is that bad? Why is that a bad thing? And usually, if they were to rationalize it, if you were to ask this question to them, they're going to come up with something along the lines of, well, it creates income inequality. The income inequality argument is dumb even in and of itself, because there is nothing inherently immoral about a boss making more than his employee. If they're both engaged in a mutually agreeable and mutually beneficial relationship where one person makes money and the other person does as well, then who cares? I don't really care if my boss makes way more than I do. The income inequality argument itself is dumb because it ignores the whole picture. If a very wealthy person gives you a job, then you're still better off than if you didn't have a job. It doesn't matter that they make a lot more than you. You're still making more money than you would if they didn't have that money to employ you in the first place. And so this is the problem with the income inequality argument as a whole, is that it doesn't look at the whole picture. It looks at a relationship between two individuals and makes the assumption that one person making more and one person making less is somehow wrong. Well, if you're doing the same work, then I kind of agree with them. If they have the same level of experience, they've been with the company for the same amount of time, and they produce the same thing, then to a degree I kind of see what they're talking about. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the CEO of a company, somebody that has put in a lot of work, a lot of risk, a lot of it probably his own capital in a lot of cases, to be able to risk his entire livelihood to be able to build his own company. I don't think that guy should be making the same as the guy who's the janitor, or the guy who's just started out at the company that the CEO may have been there for 30 years. And by the way, I'm not disparaging the janitor. There's probably quite a few janitors that make a lot more than I do. And I've done some janitorial work, not as a janitor myself, but being a maintenance man, you do have to do some cleaning up when you're at a hotel. And so, I've cleaned bathrooms and that kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with that. It's good, honest work. But the idea that somehow this person that's doing a low-skill job should be making the same as the guy making decisions and risking his own capital and risking his own livelihood at the top doing this is just silly. And here's the thing about the income inequality, and I'll explain to you why it's such a stupid argument. Let's say that you're in a situation where you are making $20,000 and your boss is making $100,000. Okay, well, that's income inequality. In fact, your boss is making 5 times more than you do. But let's say you had to choose between that and a situation where you're making $100,000 and your boss is making $100 million. Well, now your boss is making 100 times more than you are. But you would still pick, regardless of the income inequality, you would still pick the second scenario because you're making 5 times what you did in the first scenario. You'd much rather make $100,000 than you would $20,000. And who would blame you? You're still coming out on top. So the fact is, you're doing better regardless of how much your boss is making. My boss making more money does not mean that I'm making less. And it doesn't bother me if he makes a lot of money. If you're in a situation where everybody's making more, who cares if some people are making more than you? This is the problem with the whole system. The whole argument of income inequality is it is based upon envy. It is based upon the idea that they shouldn't be making that much. Because if you're looking at the results of capitalism versus socialism, the difference is in socialism, you have everybody poor, with the exception of a handful of fat cats at the top. Which again, I do think it's hilarious that socialism is always for the people, not the socialist. The socialist somehow always comes out on top. The socialist is somehow always provided for. And let's be honest, Bernie Sanders isn't exactly hurting for money. The guy has 3 houses. 3 very expensive houses. And so this idea that we should just give away all of our wealth, that people shouldn't be making that much more than other people, first of all, never works, because in a socialist society, there's always somebody that's making a lot. There's always somebody, for example, in Venezuela, you've got what's-his-face down there, Menudo, who was unfortunately caught eating a empanada on screen where he's got people waiting in line for 3 hours for a can of beans in his country. So yeah, the socialist never really misses a meal. It's the people that have to deal with the consequences of socialism. The masses, the faceless, human refuge that out there in the country. That's for you people. But let's just ignore that for a second. Let's just say that socialism worked the way Karl Marx would want to. Why would you opt to be in a system where everybody is making the same if you're making less than you would in a capitalist system? I don't really care how much money Bill Gates makes. I don't really care how much money, Warren Buffett or Oprah or any of those people, because it doesn't take away from what I have. Their income has no impact whatsoever on my income, unless it's a positive one. Because if you're operating in a system where people, to be able to become wealthy, have to make other people wealthy, or at the very least wealthier, in the process of doing so, then the rising tide lifts every ship. Bill Gates has made my life richer in a number of ways. Not because I've ever worked for him, and not because he's ever personally given me money, but the inventions that he's come up with have saved me a lot of time. I'm somebody that uses a Windows operating system a lot. The fact that I'm coming to you right now is the result, at least in part, of Bill Gates' ideas and his work. Because he invented the Windows operating system, which was a better operating system than any that existed. And the, progeny of that, the continuation of that system has continued to improve, made computers faster, so on and so forth. And so in so many ways, the reason that I am able to continue my career and be able to bring this content to you is because of a guy that I've never had any relationship with in a strict economic sense whatsoever, because he had good ideas and invented better technology that benefited everyone. I'm able to make money because of a good idea that somebody else had that I'm never going to see a dime of his money. And I'm fine with that. I'm okay with that. Bill Gates should be a very rich person because he made a lot of people's lives easier. And so by serving mankind in that way, by coming up with a really good idea that people liked, he was made richer and compensated for that. And he should be able to do that. And when it comes to this, when you're looking at this relationship between your CEO and your boss, I don't care if my boss is making 10,000 times what I am, as long as I'm making what I was promised. Because him having a lot of money means that I get more money in the process too. If he's coming up with good ideas and innovative new ways to come to audiences, then that grows my business, that grows my perception in the public, and I'm able to make more money as a result of that. And so I just don't understand this idea. It's all based upon the idea of envy, that they're just upset that there's somebody making so much more than them. I don't care. It does not bother me that other people are doing well. And I do think it's hilarious coming from Bernie because he talks about the people on top as if he's not one of the people on top. Again, Bernie Sanders is a part of the 1%. He is part of that population that is making a lot of money. And he's doing so at taxpayer expense because he couldn't get a job in the private sector. If you don't believe me, look at his personal history. The guy's never had a real job outside of working in the government. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, my father worked as a member of the government. He was a public school teacher, which is a employee of the state. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that or noble. I'm just saying that, let's be honest, Bernie Sanders would not be able to make it in the private sector. In fact, he tried and failed. The only job he's ever had is being a politician who spends other people's money. That's the only thing he's ever known. And so let's look at this from the average person in the 1980s to today, because he's asserting that somehow economically we were so much better off in the 80s as opposed to now because CEOs were making closer to their employees' wages. Again, let's look at whether or not the world is a better place and people in the 1980s are actually wealthier then than they are now. First of all, let's look at cell phones. Cell phones back in the day used to be pretty massive. And let's just take a look at a clip here to give you kind of an idea of what that looked like.
Hello, Zach Morris's phone.
Your track opens at noon, and the first race is at 1? Okay, thanks. Bye.
You know, that's a clip from one of my favorite shows, Saved by the Bell, something that I was growing up. That show took place, and that's actually post-80s. That would have been more the 90s. But what you're seeing there is that's what cell phones used to look like. They were a giant brick. They had a battery that lasted about 2 minutes. And the cell phone plans themselves were horrible. You had to wait until like after 9 o'clock to make a call that didn't cost you like $2 a minute. I mean, it was insane how expensive cell phone plans were. And the cell phone only did one thing. It called people. That's it. Nothing else. Couldn't take pictures, couldn't get on the internet. There was no internet to get on at the time. You couldn't Google anything because Google didn't exist. You could call people. That's it. There was no texting, nothing. That's what cell phones used to be. And they used to be basically a luxury for very rich people. That's more or less the only thing that they could do. But at the time, that was cutting edge technology. But that's people in the 1980s versus people now. And now people, I mean, I've even seen homeless people that have phones, smartphones. And so you're comparing the wealth of people in the 1980s to now. When you're looking at cell phones, there's just absolutely no comparison. And based on the competition that we've had, the competition between the big companies, we eventually got to the point where just about every cell phone plan is unlimited. You can call anybody for any number of minutes. Your data plan is basically unlimited now. That has gotten to the point to where, because of competition between the companies competing for your dollar, in other words, capitalism, eventually we got to the point to where virtually every cell phone plan is great. Especially if you're comparing them to what was going on in the 1980s, where even calling somebody would cost you a ton of money if it wasn't done in your free minutes period. All right, well, let's look at TVs. Back in the 1980s, a 19-inch color TV cost about $450 to $500 according to tvhistory.tv. So you're looking at a 19-inch. That's not a huge TV set. A 19-inch color television, so it was in color, $450 to $500. A 26-inch Sony color TV was about $1,000 to $1,400 in 1982. Now, I want you to keep in mind, none of those figures are adjusted for inflation. That's just the raw number. If it were adjusted for inflation, it would actually be far more. So in $1980, we're talking about a 19-inch TV being about $500 and a 26-inch TV being anywhere from $1,000 to $1,400. And keep in mind, these were not smart TVs. They didn't have Netflix. They didn't have Wi-Fi. They didn't have YouTube. They couldn't connect to your cell phone. These were just TVs. And you probably had to buy a $20 or $30 adapter to hook them up to your Nintendo. This is not an exaggeration. This is how it was in the 1980s. And yet now we have big, I'm talking like, I think my TV, for example, it's a 48-inch, 47-inch, something like that. It's around that area. And it's a smart TV with all these features. I can watch Netflix. I can watch Amazon. I have basically TV a la carte. You can watch Sling if you want to. I have cable, all the hookups for all my game systems. And it wound up costing me about $300. Now, granted, I got a good deal on it, but you think about that. A high-def TV with picture light years beyond what was available then. And it's way cheaper than it used to be. If this horrible, evil, greedy capitalist society was really just gouging people and upcharging them, then how did our technology get that much better and the price get that much cheaper. I'm paying way less than I did for a far inferior system in the 1980s compared to today. And these TVs are available to the average person. There used to be a time where a poor person, yeah, they probably kind of had a crappy TV. Now you walk into just about anybody's house, regardless of their income, and they may not necessarily have a massive TV, but they got a pretty good sized television set. I mean, I can't remember the last time I went to somebody's house, even somebody that I knew didn't really make a whole lot, that they didn't at least have about a 30-inch TV. And so they're light years ahead of where we were in the 1980s. Let's look at cars. Cars are another thing that are kind of universal in America, especially in the South. Cars are way better and far cheaper. The Toyota Camry in 1980, well, actually, you don't even have to go back then. The Toyota Camry in 1997 would have been about 7% cheaper today than it would be in 1997, according to the Washington Post. And if you're looking at the BMW 3 Series, that is 13% cheaper, and the Honda Odyssey is 16% cheaper from about that same period, the mid-1990s. So we're not even going all the way back to the 80s. Even if you're looking at the 90s, which is far more recent, we're seeing that adjusted for inflation, they're about 13 and 16% cheaper. And you also have to keep in mind that they're cheaper despite the fact that they have a lot more features. We're talking about Bluetooth, AC, power windows, satellite radio, airbags. Now, some of those things sound standard issue today, and they are, like AC and airbags. But back in the year 1980, that wasn't necessarily the case. Not all cars had an AC system. They became more common by the 1980s, but it wasn't guaranteed. And power windows were kind of a luxury. They were add-on items that you had to pay for later. So when you're looking at this, I mean, it's just abundantly clear that we are richer in really every aspect of that. Let's look at houses. Houses are better. Let's go ahead and look at this graphic here. So if you're looking at this chart, the average house size in America, this is the average house size, so your square footage. You're looking at 1975, then go to 1980, you go all the way to about 2015, which is where this study ends. You're looking at the average house size and the median house size skyrocket, and the average household size actually goes down. So not only are you getting a bigger house, but you're getting a bigger house with less people living in it, so everybody has a lot more space. When you're comparing from, a couple decades ago to the next one. So by every measure, Americans are getting far richer, whether you're looking at cars and houses or you're looking at, your tech stuff. In every respect of the word, we are getting more and more richer. We have more and more stuff available to us, and we're getting it at a cheaper price because of competition, because of the marketplace. So in 1980, we're floating at just around the 1,600 square foot mark. I'll bring that graphic up. If you're looking at the size of houses in 1980, we're floating at just about the 1,600 square foot mark. By 2015, you're seeing that we're at the 2,700 square foot mark. So that is a 60% increase in house size since 1980. Also notice that the average house size dropped by half a person. So again, we have less people living with more space. And we're also, you could say in all these things, well, okay, well, you're dealing with tech, and because you're dealing with tech, tech just tends to advance, and so that's not really a great measure. But then we're looking at cars, and we're looking at houses, which have better features, better technology, and your house size is even increasing, so you're getting more for your dollar because of competition. You're saying, yeah, well, those aren't necessarily standard, and Americans do tend to buy bigger houses over time. Yeah, all of that's true because of the marketplace. But let's say you fall prey to those arguments. Let's say that you go for something that is standard for everybody across the globe. Everybody's got to eat. Everybody's got to eat. That's a pretty good measure for how well a country is doing economically. How much are they spending on food, and what percentage of their income is spent on food? So we did a little research on that as well. Let's look at this this graphic. So this is how much Americans are spending on food, their total food as a percentage of their income, and then food at home, and then food away from home. So you're looking at restaurants. Now, food away from home does increase a little bit. So you are seeing that as time goes on, people are eating out a little more, spending a little bit more of their cost of food on restaurants. But if you're looking at every other metric, it's going down by a lot. You're thinking about this as a percentage of your total income. We're looking at, in the 1980s, food is about 14% on total and about 9% of your food at home. So food that you cook at home, groceries, that kind of thing. In 2012, the total is a little bit under 10 and a little bit less than 6% for food at home. So in other words, if you're comparing now to the 1980s, we are spending about 3 to 4% less on our income on food. And when you spend less on essentials like food, you get to spend more on luxuries. So there is absolutely no metric that I've been able to find that you could look at Bernie Sanders' tweet and say, yeah, that has really caused a problem for the country. We're a lot less wealthy now. This idea that we have this shrinking middle class and that life's so much worse than it was back then because people were making closer to what they were with their bosses, there's not an ounce of truth to that. If everybody is wealthier, if everybody is doing better, again, to go back to my initial analogy, if everybody is making 5 times what they did then why do you care that the guy that is your boss is making 100 times more than you? Why is that a problem if everybody is wealthier? If we're living in a system that gives everybody cheaper things and gives it to them more abundantly, then why does anyone care whether or not their boss is making a little more than they are? I do not understand that argument. This income inequality thing, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you be upset about that? And really what it all boils down to is that socialism is billed as a force that combats greed. That's what they keep saying. We've heard that 1,000 times. It's like, well, capitalism is greedy and people at the top are greedy. But socialism is built on envy. The whole idea of socialism is that there should not be people making more than other people. Regardless of their skill, regardless of the work that they put in or the risk or whatever, they're saying that all the outcomes ought to be equal. Well, that whole premise is based on envy. That's you being worried about what other people are having and you wanting to bring them down. You wanting them to not have things. But when you're talking about capitalism, everybody does better. Why do you care that there are other people that make more than you? It's silly and it's envious and actually it's sinful to be so worried about what other people have and be worried that there are other people with more things than you. Socialism is the gospel of envy. The whole system is based on that premise. And that's the reason that it is evil and immoral, because it just brings everybody down to your level out of spite. And it makes everybody poorer. All socialism does is spread the misery around to everybody. And that's why it's abundantly clear that Bernie Sanders has no freaking idea what he's talking about when it comes to economics, and saying that everybody is worse off now than they are in the 1980s. I really love personal liberty. I believe in freedom of expression and freedom of association. And so it is completely up to you whether or not you want to like this video and subscribe to the Tactics Radio YouTube channel. However, I will say this. You know who else never subscribed to my channel? Hitler. So the way I see it, you have 2 options. You can either like this video and subscribe to Tactics Radio on YouTube, or you can be like Hitler. Totally up to you.